Hello and welcome everyone. I'm so honored to welcome you all tonight to this very special event, Verses versus War. For some housekeeping, I wanted to let you know that captioning has been enabled for this event. So if it would help you to see the live captioning of what's being said at the bottom, you can turn that on by pushing the CC or the View Transcript button at the bottom. You might have to click on the More button to access it. It is done by robots. It's an automated process, so I excuse the many errors that will be there in the captioning. This event is also being recorded, and we will send the recording out to all registrants later. Feel free to use the chat, to introduce yourself in it, to comment in it. I just ask, of course, that you do so respectfully. And any questions that are posed to the poets in the chat will be collected, and we'll gather them so that we can pose many of them to the poets later in the event. All right, so my name is Rachel Small. I work at World Beyond War, a global movement to abolish war and establish a just and sustainable peace. I'm thrilled to see that we are being joined here tonight by people from really across the world. I looked at the registrations right before we started and noted that audience members had registered to attend from at least 27 different countries. So welcome everyone. I myself am based in Tkarondo, often called Toronto in Canada, which, like many of the cities people here are joining from, is one that's built on stolen Indigenous land. It's land that's the ancestral territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe peoples, and it's land that needs to be given back. Tonight, or I should say this afternoon or this morning, depending on where on the planet you're joining us from, as we gather together, I know that so many of us right now are rattled, perhaps horrified, perhaps very scared, watching bombs drop, watching horrible military violence unfold in Ukraine. I know some of us here may perhaps be worried about family members and friends or strangers in Ukraine, about those bravely protesting the war in places where the consequences for doing so can be enormous. I was seeing reports earlier that over 1,700 anti-war protesters were arrested in Russia today, just to give an example. As World Beyond War, we say that now is an especially important time for the world to reject war, for every country to do everything within its power to de-escalate the violence, to push for peace, to recognize that there's no military solution here, to stop fanning the flames of war. And also we're remembering that unfortunately, this is not the only active site of war today, far from it. Just within the past 48 hours, for instance, there's been many other deadly airstrikes in Yemen, in Somalia, in Syria. This is an incomplete list. So all that to say tonight, I really hope that as we gather here together, that we can hold in solidarity all of the most vulnerable people around the world who are suffering, who are being killed, who are being displaced as a result of wars. These are the people who always lose every war. Well, it's the weapons companies, the billionaires, the ruling classes who always win. From our perspective, all of us need to do everything we can right now to oppose war, whether that's protest and education, analysis, advocacy. But tonight, I think it's so incredibly poignant and important that we are coming together as people all around the world to share anti-war art, to share community, to literally share poetry versus war. And I'm so thrilled that we're doing so today in conversation with these two incredible award-winning poets. I think that in contrast to the media messaging we're bombarded with that tends to insist that there's always one evil antagonist, that we should deny the humanity of the other, or that takes for granted that the only possible response to military violence is more military violence, I would suggest that poetry does and has always offered us more possibilities, perhaps might be one of the strongest antidotes we do have to the drumbeat of war. So I just feel so honored to be helping to hold this space for all of us here tonight. And Right now, I'm thrilled to invite up Tricia Herman, the outreach coordinator at A Different Book List, to the stage. A Different Book List is an incredible bookstore, cultural center here in Toronto that focuses on social justice and focuses on literature from the African diaspora, from the Caribbean. It's such a vital part of the literature and also, as I mentioned, the social justice community here in Toronto. We're thrilled that they're co-hosting this event with us. So welcome, Tricia.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you so much for considering A Different Book List for this. We reflect on the ways in which literature has had such a giant impact on the ways in which we push back against war. And we think about the Black Panthers and how Frantz Fanon's work had such an impact on how they moved through spaces and how they built up their tactical insurgency. So we definitely do recognize the need to think of alternative ways in which we could deal with conflict and push back against. And I'm very happy that you mentioned the many wars that are happening. We have the front and center war right now, but the many wars that are happening, a lot of them, just about all of them for political gain. And those who really suffer from it, we don't really get to tap into those stories. And I'm very reflecting on the works of Gary and George. You recognize the ways in which, specifically, even with Gary's looking at the ventriloquist, thinking through the ways in which these poets could speak forth and speak to those very personal human experiences. So we do recognize the ways in which literature, and that is part of what A Different Book List is, recognize the ways in which literature can be an avenue to push back. So we're absolutely very grateful, and we do recognize the work of your organization and the importance of that. I do want to take a moment to mention the Jamaican theorist Rex Nettleford, who speaks to art as an avenue of insight into experiences. And I love how he always speaks to the ways in which the artist has a specific way of tapping into experiences and kind of has this way of this avenue of foresight that they could see into situations that are happening, which is why I'm so grateful for poetry, and specifically the way that poetry gets you to the heart of the thing, to the very nuances of the human experience that we have with, specifically with George and Gary's art. So I'll take a moment to introduce the authors right now, give their bios. George Elliott Clarke is the 4th Poet Laureate of Toronto and the 7th Parliamentary Canadian Poet Laureate. A professor of English at the University of Toronto, Clarke has also taught at Duke, McGill, UBC, and Harvard. His recognitions include the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center Fellowship, Pierre Elliott Trudeau Fellows Prize, the Governor General's Award for Poetry, National Magazine Gold Award for Poetry, Premier Poetess Romania, the Eric Hoffer Book Award for Poetry and International Fellow Poet of the Year, and so Encyclopedic Poetry School 2019. His acclaimed titles include Whalia Falls, Beatrice Chancy Execution Poems, Blues and Bliss, Elliott Sonnets, Traverse, and Canticles. Gary Geddes has written and edited more than 50 books of poetry, fiction, drama, nonfiction, criticism, translation, and anthologies, and been the recipient of a dozen national and international literary awards, including the Commonwealth Poetry Prize, National Magazine Gold Award, the Governor's Award for Literary Excellence, Freedom to Read Award, and the Gabriela Mistral Prize from the Government of Chile, awarded simultaneously to Octavia Paz, Václav Havel, Ernesto Cardinal, Raphael Alberti, and Mario Benedetti. He has lectured and performed his work in 20 countries and been translated into 6 languages. Very much so, we want to recognize these powerful poets in our presence. And without further ado, I would like to welcome and to our presence and into the space, Gary Geddes.
Actually, I think we will start with George tonight. Sorry, Trisha, and then we'll move to Gary. Thank you.
I'm sorry. So we begin with George Elliott Clarke. Apologies. Welcome, George.
Thank you so much, Trisha. And this is a terrible day in terms of our introduction to this unfolding century. On one hand, I want to say what a great pleasure and honor and privilege it is to share this space this evening with all of us who care about peace and who demand an end to war. And specifically, I'm very honored to be able to recite poetry in the company of Gary Geddes. And I'm also, of course, very honored to be part of this evening and the proceedings of World Beyond War, WBW. When we first talked about this evening, organizing this evening, more than a month ago, it was essentially theoretical. Happily theoretical in the sense that, yes, we wanted to speak against, and we are going to speak against war through our poetry tonight. But even though we were aware of the drumbeats of war that were going on everywhere, in Europe as well as in Asia, and in Africa, and so on, I don't think any of us thought that we would be actually speaking on the very night that an active invasion is taking place in Eastern Europe. So it's a great shock, and that causes me to temper my enthusiasm somewhat for our discussion tonight. On the other hand, poetry transcends time, transcends history. Unfortunately, as Byron said, history is the devil's scripture. So in a sense, the horrible events of today are horrible in a series of horrible events going back centuries and millennia, which doesn't make it any easier. On the other hand, it means that I'm not going to try and speak for Gary, I'll just speak for myself, but I hope I can say that I join legions of poets, present and past, in responding to these kinds of conflicts with the power of our words. And so I'm very honored again and privileged to be able to take part in this program tonight.
George, I wonder if you would share a little bit about the context of anti-war poetry, with how you come to that, and maybe share a first poem with us.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. I'm speaking tonight from Toronto, Ontario, where I live and work. But I'm from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which many people probably don't know is one of the world's 3 deepest harbors. And in the days of sail, it was extremely important because it never froze. It's in the North Atlantic. And every ship that passes between Western Europe and North America must pass by Halifax. And so that has made it an extremely important military port through its history since its founding in 1749. And Halifax was founded deliberately to attack the fortress of Louisbourg, which was a French imperial possession in present-day Cape Breton. And of course, British forces did attack Louisbourg in 1760, and they did so from Halifax. Halifax is a NATO base. It's also probably on the target for whoever wants to launch missiles at North America. They would probably want to target Halifax, unfortunately. And Halifax, as a Canadian city and as a North American city, is one of the few that has actually suffered the consequences of international conflict. I refer to December 6, 1917, when 2 ships collided in Halifax Harbor, and one of them was a munitions ship that was loaded with picric acid, TNT, benzene, and the impact of the explosion, that ship caught fire after the collision with another ship in Halifax Harbor. The collision resulted in a detonation of what was essentially a floating bomb. And the world's greatest human-caused explosion before Hiroshima, the explosion that tore through Halifax City, my home city, had the force of 2 kilotons of atomic weaponry. And in fact, the Americans, when they were planning to bomb Hiroshima or other Japanese cities, studied Halifax and studied the impact of that explosion, which created a mushroom cloud, killed 2,000 people outright, rendered 20,000 homeless, and again was had a force equivalent to a low-yield nuclear device. But I grew up there. So I grew up with this heritage of a city that was founded for war. I come from a city that was founded in order to allow the British to attack any place they wanted to in the North Atlantic or the South Atlantic, although Halifax was the capital of the Royal Navy's North Atlantic Fleet. So I grew up with that. I come from a city that's dotted with war memorials. I come from the working class north end of Halifax, where a lot of sailors come from. I went to school with kids who were children of sailors. And so I've got that heritage in me. So I grew up with the knowledge of potential annihilation, the knowledge that people are always being called out to go to war, and so on from my home city. And so I come to the reciting of this poetry with that heritage, as well as the heritage of struggle against slavery as someone of African American and indigenous Cherokee ancestry, the struggle against colonialism and imperialism, which essentially allowed, as far as I'm concerned, Europe to introduce a whole series of barbarities to the places they were colonizing. So thank you for the invitation tonight. Thank you for allowing me to recite this poem. I think in the context of everything that's going on today, I need to read this poem, which is titled St. Augustine of Hippo, Roman Africa, invents the just war doctrine. And yeah, he did. He's responsible for that. I emphasize, St. Augustine is responsible for inventing the just war doctrine. So this poem is in his voice, and so here it is. God grants it just to turf out dictators, to extirpate their joking crimes. So policy mandates a palaver of palookas, a menagerie of heroes, handy at battle axe, schooled in sail, and all manner of face-to-face mangling, to roam the Rhone, and rhyme with foam the Rhine, chop up the sea into waves, and God's foes into sausage. The tumult of wounds, maggot-pampered putrefaction, the overhanging arrows whistling instantly downward to thud bluntly heathens' hearts or heads, so that they jolt awake alive, burning in the sulphurous stench of hell, guarantees us our justice. If it comes to pass that an accursed cur, some whoreson pup, feels our soldier's spear stick in his chest, so his jaws strain to grab at ear any morsel of oxygen, but only blood blubbers from his mouth, so be it. It's his damnation for having charged at our fluttering spears. The uplifted wave crest brazen, flood of the tips, descending to perforate the flesh of horses and shatter the opposing forces, questionable men to pieces punctured. I cannot conceive any philosophy sparing God's opponents searing pain. The city of God pledges Antichrist hordes, chomping steel and snickering fire, plus howling arrows and spears bristling, blitzing the sky. So hell comes to house obnoxious corpses, choice slabs for jagged-mouthed dogs. God's enemies get blazed to the bone, and next the bones baked down to ash. Christ's soldiers sweep away the pagan camp like a hand wiping maggots from meat, and we axe off extremities and foreskins as dainties for pigs. Smoldering drops of blood sizzle once encountering flame. This is justice that venal foreigners outside baptism discover in their rotting flesh, beautiful wounds embittered by glittering insects.
Thank you. What a horrible poem. Like, what a powerful, horrible poem. Horrible on purpose. Clearly, like, I feel it in my body, that in those descriptions of violence. I wonder, for those of us who maybe don't know as much as we should about our ancient history, what you can tell us about St. Augustine and what drew you to write this poem.
Well, I was drawn to write the poem, driven to write the poem, because in my epic poem, which I call Canticles, excuse the ad here for it, but I deliberately want to meditate on the forces that created the transatlantic slave trade and that brought European colonialism and imperialism to occupy the southern half of the globe in particular, and part of the northern half of the globe as well in terms of Turtle Island, to enrich itself and to teach those who were colonized that they were inferior, that they deserved to be oppressed, that they deserved to be enslaved. But St. Augustine is one of those characters. I gotta say, he's a character that is double-sided, because on the one hand, there's a tradition that insists that he's African. He was from North Africa, and some scholars think that he was black, and I want to go along with that. But just because he's black doesn't mean that he was absolutely virtuous or that he was actually virtuous. But let's pretend that he was black. Here's a black person who is putting forward a doctrine that is going to justify the worst kinds of violence against people who are practically utterly defenseless. And he has the nerve to describe this as being just war. And we fast forward 2,000 years to right now, and we've got Putin saying this is justified, and we have the West saying we're going to be justified in pushing back against you. So what's the game? Where's the theological transcendence that Augustine may have thought that he was putting forward? All he did was make it possible for people to run to the protection of religion as they decided they were going to attack other human beings.
I think that the way you use the word justice in the poem in such different tones at different spots, it just so definitely undermines, like, what do we even mean when we say justice here? What did they mean? What do we mean now? I think it's so powerful. I want to let Gary respond, and then I also would love to hear from Gary some of his background coming here and a poem as well.
Well, George, thank you so much for that poem. You've got such an incredible range of diction, the high and low diction, the organ bass of sound, the recurring consonants and vowels. It's music to my ears, and the sheer joy of sound is there in spite of the devastatingly negative view of this man and some of his values. It's a sad and sobering day to be zooming in to talk with all you folks about poetry, as the dogs of war are being set loose yet again. And not just because of the greed, fear, and hubris of one man. It has a lot to do with the culture of militarism, imperialism, and impunity that's alive and well worldwide. Anyway, I'm honored to be here to share some thoughts and poems with folks from at least 27 different countries. I'm speaking to you from a tiny island on the ragged western edge of Canada, situated on stolen territory of the Penelakut First Nation. It's interesting that Thetis Island is not named after the legendary Homeric mother of Achilles, Thetis, the marine goddess. It's named after a British ship that trashed local communities of indigenous people in the early colonial days here. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, and thanks to David Swanson, Rachel Small, Tricia, and colleagues at World Beyond War for making this happen, and for the vigorous and important efforts they're making to speak out against militarism and war. I spent much of my life writing about war and war-related subjects, perhaps because I was born during World War II and grew up absorbing the wartime anxieties of my own family, including the death by bombing of 2 relatives in the English coastal town of Bournemouth. This was followed by news that my Vancouver uncle, Tom Turner, was reported missing when the Lancaster bomber he was navigating was shot down over Hamburg. My father was also sucked into the vortex, or the black hole of war, contributing to the breakup of his marriage. At school in the early 1950s, I was required to crawl under the desk during air raid exercises, ostensibly to protect me in the event of a nuclear attack. Later, I discovered the great anti-war novels, including Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, about the Allied bombing of Dresden, and Charles Yale Harrison's Generals Die in Bed, about the senseless and horrific deaths of young men during World War I, and Timothy Findley's The Wars. These books were so powerful, and so too were the poems of Wilfred Owen and Randall Jarrell. Here's Jarrell's poem called The Death of the Balter at Gunnell. It's very short and devastating. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. None of these poets or novelists romanticized or glorified war. They wrote so powerfully about its madness and its physical, emotional, and environmental ravages that I was moved to add my voice to a subject that deeply troubled me then and still does. That's why I'm here tonight, and also why I've brought together 4 of my out-of-print, book-length narrative poems in a single volume called The Ventriloquist, Poetic Narratives from the Womb of War, to keep their message and whatever magic they might still possess alive and accessible. So I'm going to start my contribution as a poet with a poem that's not in this book. It's about a momentous event that took place in the United States at Kent State University in Ohio on the 4th of May, 1970. The students at Kent State were protesting the escalation of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. I was at a similar protest outside the US consulate in Toronto. Someone tapped me on the shoulder to give me the news. The Ohio National Guard had opened fire on the crowd of unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. 211 rounds of assault weapon ammunition. I was shocked, outraged. It seemed as if a gap the size of the Grand Canyon had opened up between me and my parents' generation. 6 years later, well, I should say first, as much as I tried to write about it, I could produce nothing but angry diatribes against a more American foreign policy. And there were enough of those, they didn't need another from a Canadian whippersnapper. 6 years later, during a snowstorm in Edmonton, I found myself slipping into the warmth of a secondhand bookstore on White Avenue called the Wee Book Inn. That's where I found in the political science section a small red paperback by I.F. Stone, the great American journalist, called The Killings at Kent State. I paid $1 for the book and headed home in the blowing snow. 4 details about one of the victims caught my attention. The young woman being described was a speech therapy student. She was very tidy. She liked to roller skate, and she was not especially political. I chucked my 6 years worth of angry diatribes and created in a few hours an elegy for this young woman, and also perhaps for the soldier who had spent his life knowing what he'd done to her. The poem is named after her. It's called Sandra Lee Scheuer, killed at Kent State University, May 4, 1970, by the Ohio National Guard. You might have met her on a Saturday night, cutting per cycles clockwise at the Moonglow roller rink, or walking with quick step between the campus and a green 2-story house, where the room was always tidy, the bed made, the books in confraternity on the shelves. She did not throw stones, major in philosophy, or set fire to buildings, though acquaintances say she hated war, had heard of Cambodia. In truth, she wore a modicum of makeup, a brassiere, and could no doubt more easily have married a guardsman than cursed or put a flower in his rifle barrel. While the armories burned, she studied, bent low over notes, speech therapy books, pages open at sections on impairment, physiology. And while they milled and shouted on the commons, she helped a boy named Billy with his lisp, saying, "Hiss, Billy, like a snake. That's it. Sss. Tongue well up and back behind your teeth. Now buzz, Billy, like a bee. Feel the air vibrating in my windpipe as I breathe." As she walked in sunlight through the parking lot at noon, feeling the world a passing lovely place, a young guardsman who had his sights on her was going down on one knee as if he might propose. His declaration, unmistakable, articulate, flowered within her, passed through her neck, severed her trachea, taking her breath away. Now who will burn the midnight oil for Billy, ensure the perilous freedom of his speech? And who will see her skating at the Moonglow roller rink, the 8 small wooden wheels making their countless revolutions on the floor? I'll pass the torch back to you now, Rachel.
Ooh. Yeah, I'm still in that last image. It's almost hard to respond. I am so struck that you say you wrote the poem in just a few hours, but in a way, maybe you were writing it for those 6 years, and maybe you were writing it in some ways for your whole life. And it seems like this poem has legs of its own. And I read this poem long before I think I had maybe heard your name, and certainly long before I met you. And I'm wondering why you think this poem, I feel like, has become the poem of this massacre, and why you feel that it has resonated clearly with so many people.
Well, I think I learned that anger isn't part of my toolbox for writing poetry. The anger has to be translated into something more intimate and powerful. And the enormity of the Kent State of killings and the Vietnam War were just too much for me to put into a poem. And it was only those 4 details that I found in I.F. Stone's book that allowed me to focus on one sad moment and one person's death in that whole process. So I think it had to do with that. And something happened to me in the writing of that poem. The image of the soldier going down on one knee harks back to the comment that she could more easily have married a guardsman than put a flower in his rifle barrel. So there's a kind of structuring going on there that I hadn't experienced or achieved ever in a poem before like that. So I just put it down to the power of this past voice speaking through me.
Thank you. And I'm seeing lots of folks in the chat sort of chiming in about how powerful it is, how much heart and also heartbreaking this piece is. George, I wanted to give you a chance to do something that Gary had also done in his introduction, which was to share lines from another poet that resonate for you on this theme of versus war. I had mentioned ahead of time to maybe think about some that might resonate for you. I wonder if you had chose one and wanted to share.
Well, yeah, and I also just want to comment very quickly that poem, Gary, is phenomenal, and really brings to life the horrible effect of this organized violence against regular people going about their lives. And of course, I think about that terrible, awful, horrible phrase that was invented during the first Gulf War. This idea of collateral damage, and the cold-bloodedness of that phrase, and the idea that people horribly disfigured, damaged, destroyed by munitions can somehow be totted up as simply accidental carnage, for crying out loud. And so your poem really brings that fact to life, and is very moving, and so it's again a privilege for me to be sharing this space with you and to hear that poem again. Um, so I'm going to read just a few lines from Hiroshima Mon Amour. Here's the advertisement for the French New Wave film. Text by Marguerite Duras for the film by Alain Resnais from 1960. And of course, the film is about a French woman who falls in love with a Japanese man in Hiroshima, and in the context of their relationship, remembers her love affair with a German soldier in occupied France, who is killed at the very end of World War II. So here it is. She, and they have no names. It's she and he. So she, I saw the newsreels. On the second day, history tells, I'm not making it up. On the second day, certain species of animals rose again from the depths of the earth, and from the ashes, dogs were photographed for all eternity. I saw them. I saw the newsreels. I saw them on the first day, on the second day, on the third day. He, interrupting her, you saw nothing, nothing. A dog with a leg amputated, people, children, wounds, burned, children screaming. She. On the 15th day, too, Hiroshima was blanketed with flowers. There were cornflowers and gladiolas everywhere, and morning glories and day lilies that rose again from the ashes with an extraordinary vigor quite unheard of for flowers till then. I didn't make anything up.
Wow.
Oh. Go ahead, Gary.
No, it's just such a powerful poem. I'm grateful to you, George, for bringing that up, and also for giving me another perspective on St. Augustine. I have a quotation from him that I've used in an essay, which I have to go to rethink now. He said, "The world is a book, and those who only travel those who don't travel read only one chapter." It's a great line, but now I've got to rethink that I want to promote anything about St. Augustine.
He's a complicated guy, to put it mildly, right? But yeah, he's also the servant of an empire, Rome, or what's left of the Holy Roman Empire, and so on, and he's in service to the powers that be. in articulating that doctrine. So, yeah, he's complicit, absolutely.
I had a question that I wanted to ask both of you before we hear a little bit more poetry from each of you. I'm very fortunate in my daily life. I spend a lot of time with movement artists, visual artists, musicians, and there's often this feeling amongst them of sort of, is this enough? And on one hand, nothing any of us can do surely is enough faced with just the immense cruelty of the world. But on the other hand, I think there's something else in that question. I think capitalism can almost force us to measure our worth against a notion of productivity, right? Like our worth is measured by a certain degree of capitalist productivity. And I heard maybe this question in my head also echoed in something that a fellow poet in the audience, David Eberhard, wrote in the chat, sort of saying always, what is the best activist tactic to use? Auden said poetry accomplishes nothing. So I guess I wonder both of your response as poets to this question of, I guess, why poetry? How does poetry interact with the cruelty in the world? What do we do? Whatever you want to take from that question.
Could I start by answering David and the quotation that he gave us from the elegy that Auden wrote for William Butler Yeats? It says poetry makes nothing happen. That's been used by the political and ethical relativists to question the validity and value of art. All you have to do is read Auden's essays in the Dyer's Hand to realize that that was not his point of view, and it was not really Yeats' point of view. It was the speaker of the poem came up with that comment. Auden really said, more importantly, in one of his essays, the mere making of a work of art is a political act because it reminds the management that we are not automatons, but living beings. So for me, poetry is not only a call to arms, but also a source of healing. It speaks to the wound inside us, the part that is so often in ruins. And that's why the comment by Dylan Thomas that I'm going to share is so important. As a man with as many problems as gifts, he recognized the therapeutic dimension of poetry, both for the poet and the reader, when he said, out of the inevitable conflict of images, inevitable because of the creative, destructive, and contradictory nature of the motivating center, the womb of war, I try to make that momentary peace, which is the poem. The key word here, of course, is momentary, because peace is never permanent. It's a state of mind that needs to be cultivated and nourished daily. It's a practice, like meditation.
I would chime in by saying this, that I think Auden's speaker in his elegy for William Butler Yeats is pushing, because of course Yeats died in 1939 on the verge of what we now call the Second World War, and Auden was probably reflecting on the idea that came from various quarters, whether they were leftist or rightist, fascist or socialist or communist, that the poet had to be captive to a particular party line. And to support some political movement in that way. So that's how I tend to recite that or think about that line, that poetry makes nothing happen. But we've got Shelley to answer back. We can go back to Percy Bysshe Shelley, who said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators. And I like that idea. And I think that it speaks to actually the slow work that peace does, the slow work of peacemaking. That it may not happen overnight, that it may not be something that's achieved as quickly and as early as we would want it to be. In the same way that poetry may not make anything happen until long after we would like to see it happen, long after the poem has been written that is in favor of something that is interested in justice, interested in equality, and so on. The philosopher Marcuse said that the poems and songs of liberation are always either too early or too late. And I think there's something to that. As poets, as songwriters, as artists, as sculptors, as filmmakers, respond in a humane and humanitarian fashion to whatever crisis besets us, they may not be able to see the impact of that art, the impact of that work until long after it's been done. In our lifetime, we can remember, Gary, you and I, and you maybe a little bit more than me, but still, I was around in the 1960s, and I remember the power of the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War and other wars and violence and so on. And I remember that even though all those individual marches with their thousands or hundreds of people may have seemed like they were achieving nothing, like poetry makes nothing happen, at the end of the day, they won in the sense that peace did come to Vietnam. Aggressors were defeated. There was a moment, an opportunity for peace to actually flourish, even though there were people who were assassinated, people who were jailed, people who were thrown out of their jobs for having the wrong political line, the wrong way of thinking socially, not just in the West, but in the East and elsewhere as well. So the great challenge for us as people and as artists is to never give in to despair, no matter how deep and no matter how profound despair can be, but to move to that creativity of our art and just our thought and our and creativity in general to express our great desire for a world that is fit for us all to inhabit, flora and fauna and human beings everywhere. There's no need for us to be destroying each other. There's enough to go around, enough to share, so long as nobody's interested in trying to aggregate all power to decide everything for themselves. But I'm not going to preach anymore. One last thing to say about this, because it gives me a lot of hope. I remember John Lennon. I remember Yoko Ono. And I remember those billboards they put up around the world. I think it was December 1969. And it was such a powerful message. And it simply said, "War is over." And then in brackets, "if you want it." And I love that slogan because it puts the power back in our hands of the people, especially in democracies. We do not have to go to war if we don't want to. We can say no to war. We have the power. It's in our hands. So that message, as simple as it was, and from the standpoint of the war makers in 1969 and 70, it may have seemed like completely loony. But actually that argument, that phrase was transcendently powerful and meaningful and moving and against any kind of notion of despair.
I'd love to make one little tiny comment here, so we have some time left to read poems. But John Berger, one of my favorite art critics and novelists, had this to say: "Poetry makes language care because it renders everything intimate. There is nothing more substantial to place against the cruelty of the world than this caring." And Robert Hass, like George, who was a poet laureate, had this to say in an interview in Mother Jones: "I think that the job of poetry, its political job, is to refresh the idea of justice, which is going dead in us all the time."
I'm seeing others in the chat sharing powerful sentiments and also pointing at how visual artwork, like a piece like Guernica, how you can't look at that without wanting to say no to war in a way that probably those foreign policy arguments that you were referencing early, Gary, don't maybe achieve in the same way. I personally was just reminded of one of Audre Lorde's most famous quotes: "Poetry," I just pulled it up, "poetry is not a luxury, it's a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action."
Beautiful.
Right.
so I do want to, I of course want us to have time for everything, all the poems from both of you and all the questions from the audience. We won't get everything, but I do want to make a bit more time now for Gary to share a bit more of his poetry, then for George to do the same. In the meanwhile, we are collecting questions from the chat, and we will have time at the end to ask at least some of them and to have a discussion with the audience and the poets. So please go ahead, Gary.
A few short poems for my second installment. I'm going to share with you a poem that came out of a trip to Israel, Palestine. I was there following the Oslo Accords with my friend John Asfour, a blind Lebanese Canadian poet who hadn't been back to the Middle East for 22 years. I interviewed displaced Palestinians, Jewish settlers, politicians, former soldiers, and I was troubled by the fact, given the recent peace talks, that the Israeli Defense Force was still bulldozing the houses of anyone who had a family member arrested for protests or civil disobedience. This disturbing situation prompted the following poem. It's called "What Does a House Want?" A house has no unreasonable expectations of travel or imperialist ambitions. A house wants to stay where it is. A house does not demonstrate against partition or harbor grievances. A house is a safe haven, anchorage, a place of rest. Shut the door on excuses, greed, political expediency. A house remembers its original inhabitants, ventures comparisons, the woman tossing her hair on a doorstep, the man bent over his tools and patch of garden. What does a house want? Laughter, sounds of lovemaking to strengthen the walls. A house wants people, a permit to persevere. A house has no stones to spare. No house has ever been convicted of a felony unless privacy be considered a crime in the new dispensation. What does a house want? Firm joints, things on the level, water rising in pipes. Put out the eyes, forbid the drama of exits, entrances. Somewhere in the rubble, a mechanism leaks time. No place familiar for a fly to land on. The second poem is one that came out of my trip to Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship. 1973, September 1973, the CIA helped orchestrate a coup against Salvador Allende and the Chileans. I interviewed women with soldiers and spies everywhere. These brave women were taking great risks to share their stories with me in the Vicaria, a Catholic agency in Santiago. Most had lost husbands, sons, daughters, and other relatives, thanks to the military coup. This is called the Human Rights Commission. The small woman seated before you describes her encounters with the military. In advance of the translation, you hear the phrase, caravan of death. She's not talking about a circus. Her husband has not run away to a circus. The one was in town the day you arrived, the real McCoy. Medieval etchings of the dance of death flicker in a dark recess of your brain. Do you really want to hear this? Yesterday you were curious, took notes copiously, numbers, implements of torture, the general who traveled the provinces with his exterminators, and a chihuahua that sat on the back of the car seat licking his ear. October 23, 1973, the end of so much. 5 months later, she too is arrested, kept naked 20 days, a sack over her head. Kicks, blows, electricity, threats against the children. Pretense her husband is still alive. You look again at this woman and wonder how much she is not telling you. A heated pipe. Rats driven into the vagina through a heated pipe. When the interview began, the portable radio was playing Moon Shadow by Cat Stevens. A poster on the wall said in Spanish, "No one disappears into thin air." And the last two poems come from a sequence in the Ventriloquist called Hong Kong Poems. On October 27, 1941, two ships left Vancouver Harbor carrying 1,975 soldiers from Sea Force, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, and the Royal Rifles of Canada from Quebec City. They were being sent to Hong Kong to defend the Crown Colony against an inevitable Japanese attack, which happened on December 8, following the raid on Pearl Harbor. The poorly trained Canadians fought bravely, but they didn't have a chance against war-hardened troops. Sea Force surrendered on December 25, not exactly how they expected to celebrate Christmas. Their survivors spent 3.5 years as slave labor in brutal POW camps in Hong Kong and Japan. I interviewed many of these veterans, crawled on my belly through former battlegrounds, and read copies of the Hong Kong News and South China Morning Post under Japanese editorship. And here are the voices of two of those soldiers. This is the voice of Henderson, and I'm reading from the text right now. I did most of my fighting in Repulse Bay in a hotel half full of civilians. We took up positions in a plush suite on the second floor. One of the men sat in an armchair scanning hills out back with binoculars. When he spotted movements, I'd swing into the window and fire, then dropped back. Suddenly there was a woman in the doorway saying, "My dog, I'm looking for water for my dog." We pulled her down out of the line of fire and gave the dog radiator water we used for tea. Later, when the Japanese were 2 football fields away and their planes were dive bombing the barracks, I thought of that woman and her parting comment, "If he bothers you by barking, shoot him." This is the final moment in the Battle of Hong Kong, and this is the voice of Sullivan. A strange hush at St. Stephen's as we wait for them to storm the college. Nurses drift like butterflies among the injured, offering a word, a touch, a cigarette. When the enemy bursts through the door, I'm lying on a cot at the far end of the corridor, my head bandaged, my legs supported in a sling. 2 soldiers proceed to bayonet the sick and wounded in their beds to a chorus of screams and protests. A nurse throws herself on top of one of the boys to protect him. It might have been the kid from Queens, and they are both killed by a single thrust of the bayonet. I suppose they were sweethearts. Pinned at last, she does not struggle. Her hands open and close like tiny wings, on the dark stain on her white-stained uniform spreads like a chrysanthemum, a blood-red sun. I cut the cord supporting my leg, slip on the nearest smock, and stand foolishly at attention, making the salute. My right index finger brushes the damp cotton of the bandage. Later, the butchers are shot by their own officers. One apparently had lost a brother in the final assault.
Wow, what a dive into the almost making sense of the senselessness of war, or that's what came out for me. I wonder, how do you move from this direct personal experience, as you described, of being in a war zone or interviewing people who experience something directly, into the process of distilling some section of that into a poem? Or do you not think of it that way at all?
I sure do think about it. I'm working often in narrative poems, book-length poems, and so I know T.S. Eliot's comment about the long poem is very interesting and important to me. He said, you can't burn on at intense white heat on every page. So you have to be a master of the prosaic, the prose connective. And so for me, there's a constant shifting of emotions. So I need those really intense, as Berger said, those intimate moments when poetry makes the language care. But you also need to have a sense of the larger narrative. So there's a constant shifting for me. It's a challenge to turn something into poetry, but it's like white light through a prism. When you put something into words, it doesn't come out the same color.
Even trauma, even narrative, yeah. George, I wonder, I wanted to give you a space to respond to those powerful poems from Gary, but also I want to make sure we have some time to hear a little bit more from you before we open up to audience questions.
Well, of course, those poems are transformative and really bring home again, Gary's work brings home again the great unanswerable cost of the violence that war unleashes. And I'm also reminded of Shakespeare's line of the dogs of war being loosed. And the problem with that is that no matter how, and history tells us, no matter how well people think they plan for conquest, for invasion, for defense of whatever, there are always terrible, or frequently terrible, unexpected consequences that result in horrors unimaginable for those who first thought that they could easily prosecute a particular war, or that they could easily undertake a certain kind of defense. And that war has a logic of its own, which is, of course, Byzantine, diabolical, illogical, and which is another reason why it's so important that it not be allowed to happen, because nobody can control it once it gets going. And you just have a whole succession of horrors that unfold. And I'm reminded of the hubris of the coalition of the willing in invading Iraq in 2003, and how they thought it would just be a cakewalk. It would be very easy. They could bring justice and liberty and democracy and not a problem, and along with great contracts for oil producers, oil companies, and so on, rebuilding contracts for various American firms, especially, and other corporations backing the coalition of the willing, and how it turned into a colossal attack on human rights and civil rights and dignity and liberty, and how we are still living with the consequences of that decision of 2003, which helped to unleash ISIS and other terrorist organizations on innocent people and destroy other nations, adjacent nations. So no, I think that again is the power of Gary's poetry for making those points and bringing it all home and making it very personal for all of us. So keeping in mind the time, and I would like to slip in another poem here. Again, let me advertise again the Canticles. But in this poem, the title is To Cristoforo Colombo. And so the speaker in the poem is probably myself, I confess, speaking to Christopher Columbus, Cristoforo Colombo, and the impact of his so-called discovery of Turtle Island. Immortal, immoral, thou art first of that number, of pallid despoilers of the Americas, communicating such putrescent pox as to subject half a globe to succinct attrition, war conducted as gluttony. Thy voyageurs, brutes of prodigal ejaculations, plus Christians of deluxe criminality, do not outdo each other's lusts. Their jaws and rumps spew identical crap, their bellies flaunt, privileged bloating. The Bible shouts as each native tribe falls down. Thy bullneck centaurs lay waste to wasp waste redskins. Thy gunpowder cannonades engines down to bones and spears. One verb reverberates, annihilate, while our monarchs play at enlightenment, backing plutocrats with cannon. Thy legions mock the Odyssey of salt water with the Iliad of blood. Now, a black perfume is slavery. To confuse slavery and savory is to confuse savior and slaver. But thou readest scripture queer. Thy ruffians tip into wombs and rip open skulls, while screeching Old Testament speechifying. Negroes expire bullet riddled or get buried alive by pamphleteers. Blood, bleeding seeds, truth. See Portugal in Angola and Brasilia. Thy harsh aspect in these provinces, appearing first as gunpowder dark, blooms next as explosive light. Thou pretendest the wine dark Negro is a machine. Thy minions carnivorous, plant sharp teeth in flesh, easy to bite into, tear into, grind and gnaw. Conquistadors, musket balls, and cannonballs trample, splash, mash, crumple, destroy. Villagers turn into stumbling mobs of staggering, exhausted dead. Muscled bucks get slugged down, stabbed down, shot down. Then thy mule whip fellows, barkative, defecating expletives, the first class nigger breakers, each quaffing tin can rum, with morals as brittle as dead letter scripture, labor to coffle black labor, to off villages as trash. Thy ships bring stern boys to do biblical slaughter in Angola, in Brazil. Thy ranks feature the goat-bearded rapist with snake-head phallus. These solemn rascals smash and crush all, then grin, once horsed upon an engine whore. Thus, thy sinister trafficking continues, occluding ideas of law and order at Key West, at Rio, at Luanda, among unrest of spears, while thy Europeans stand hollering in muck as in Dante, and thy continent is consummate gun barrels and printing presses. Europe, Euripides, Europe, deicides, genocides, tragedies.
Beautiful, George. The whole history of colonialism in one poem. I can so relate to that. I've just spent so much time working with Indigenous people and the genocide in Canada that's been inflicted on them. So I'm really grateful for your powerful poetry.
And the rhythm of it, I feel like, communicates sort of this march onwards, but also sort of the immensity. And there's so many layered references in that poem. I'm sure I missed a lot of them. I want to go back to Trisha and give her the opportunity to ask the first question at this point. And in the meanwhile, I'm collecting some audience questions as well to pose after Trisha. I'd love to hear your response and the questions that you'd like to ask the poets.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. My mind is blown. My entire everything is shattered right now. Rastafarianism speaks to word, sound, power, and the ways in which this could have a massive effect, and specifically speaking about not using weapons in war, but using words, sound, and power And that was very much demonstrated tonight. Gary and George, thank you so much. It's not just the words that you spoke, but the cadences. It's just so much healing in your poetry. Thank you so much. My question is, there is so much pain and so much that you unearth, both of you, in your poems. And I can't imagine what it is like to take yourself spiritually or personally, emotionally into those spaces to create those poems. I can't imagine the ravages of personal sufferance in creating. And the fact that you return to those spaces repeatedly to create for the purpose of what you're creating is absolutely admirable. Mine is more of a proposal to you than a question in terms of the creators within the space right now who would like to use their works towards pushing back against. How do you return? Could you speak to how you return to that space? Because I can't imagine always like entering those spaces. How do you return to that space, and what words of encouragement would you have to creators to continue the work that they're doing? Because as we spoke about throughout the process, that we don't always see the effects of the work that you're doing, but it is happening slowly but surely.
I'll just leap in very quickly and say this for the other artists, creators, poets, someone who are listening tonight, and it's simply this. For me, I try to understand and I accept that I am a product of history, all of it, good, bad, indifferent. I'm here where I am in the circumstances I have because of a history of oppression, a history of resistance, a history of struggle, and that it is incumbent upon me to remember that, to honor that, and to not think that everything is just as it is because that's just the way God made it, in quotation marks, but rather that what we inhabit, the world we inhabit, is a result of real physical processes of destruction, of invasion, of corruption, of war, of disease, of climate catastrophe, of interventions of more powerful against less powerful people, enslavement, transatlantic slave trade, and all that. So that everything that we think of as being normal is actually abnormal. And I'm going to shut up in a moment, but I just want to remind myself, as an artist, as a thinker, and so on, that when we look at the great, huge economic imbalance in the world today between the North and the South, we got to remember that that's not an act of God. That's an act of 500 years of imperialism plus slavery that enriched the North, enriched Western Europe and its offshoots, and basically exploited and denuded the rest of the planet. And that if we're ever going to think about anything like fundamental justice, that imbalance needs to be corrected. So to sum up, I think it's incumbent upon us. I'm not trying to prescribe anything for anybody, so I'll just say for myself, I understand that I have to bear witness to the history that has created me and mine and my ancestors, and that is my responsibility to respond to that history and all of its ugliness and horror, as well as the beautiful stories of survival and redemption and struggle and toil and resistance, and that's our responsibility.
Sometimes people ask me where I find my subjects as a poet. I don't go looking for things to write about. They come looking for me. That's why I'm so fond of the phrase, the ventriloquism of history, which one of my graduate students brought to my attention. It seems as if there's an infinite number of disembodied essences from the recent or distant past, silenced by turmoil or time, who are wandering the earth looking for a sucker like me to tell their story. It's exciting. It's sometimes frightening, that arrangement, can take several years of your life and a good deal of stomach lining. This has happened to me with all the 4 narratives in The Ventriloquist. The irony is I'm never quite sure if I'm the ventriloquist or the dummy. But I want to say to the writers thinking about this, the person that you are makes you open to many of those disembodied voices that are waiting to have their story told. And it's up to you to look into yourself. As Yeats said, go down into that place where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And you'll find there the things that you need to write about.
I was curious about the title of your collection, The Ventriloquist, and that's interesting context to hear. I do want to take a second to encourage everyone here to actually purchase these collections by these poets, to certainly consider purchasing them from a different book list, which is a bookstore that really does make a difference, and support poets. I'm going to put some links in the chat, first to Gary's most recent collection that he was just describing, The Ventriloquist, Poetic Narratives from the Womb of War, and also to George's collection that he primarily read poems from today. I'll put that in the chat right now. George has also released a number of other books this year that are poetry, that are biography, that are autobiography, memoirs, various types. I encourage you to look them all up. If you are in a part of the world and perhaps don't want to pay shipping across the ocean from a different book list, I would, of course, encourage you to go to your local bookstore and order these books. There are a great number of very interesting comments, a lot of sort of praise, and people saying like this was the event they needed to hear tonight in the audience. There aren't a whole ton of questions, although maybe I'm seeing some coming up right now. I did want to ask about something that was in the I've just forgotten the afterword for Gary's book. No, I'm sorry. It was not the afterword. It was the very first page. There's a Margaret Atwood quote, "War is what happens when language fails." I wonder if you can tell us about why you chose to open this book with that quote.
Yes, I'm pretty conscious, as most poets are, about the inadequacies of language. And diplomacy is the thing that we were hoping would stop the events that have been launched this morning. And the diplomacy has definitely failed. There are other reasons why wars happen, not just the failure of diplomacy, but the demand for more territory, there's fear, all the hubris, all those things that I mentioned initially. And but you know, for me, the important thing about that is the emphasis on the importance of language, the use of the language, which used to be called the dialect of the tribe, that the poets are worried about keeping flexible and active the dialect of the tribe. I think I wanted to just mention that poetry is a subversive discipline. It flies beneath the radar, if I can use a military image, outside the usual paths of rational thought, in regions where sound is often more important than sense. It nests in the ear, enters the brain and the bloodstream, and has the capacity to alter the chemistry of our bodies, change the way we view ourselves and the world. It's a primary process language we learn as an infant, repeating the sounds we hear, many of which resemble or approximate the rhythms of the heartbeat. A child has no problem with cows jumping over the moon or dishes running away for a clandestine weekend in Seattle with a spoon. They love the sounds, and that pleasure of language lasts in us for a lifetime if we're willing to look for it. So poetry is a bridge, it's a substitute umbilical cord, words that connect us with the mother and those other hulking figures that we see around us as an infant. So for me, the importance of poetry is there. It's always there. When I think of something happening I'm always struggling between the impulse for story and the impulse for song. So I try to marry those two elements. And I take pay very careful attention to that ancient Chinese scribe who said, narrate as if singing, sing as if narrating.
I'm seeing a comment here from Mary. If the first casualty of war is truth, might anti-war poetry be a field hospital, the place where as much truth as possible can be saved under the horrible circumstances, which just seems to tie in so closely with what you just said. And there's an interesting question here from Sheila. How do you give voice to minorities in your poem, especially those who cannot speak? Do you want to lead us on that, George?
That's a great question, and I have a very direct and simple answer, which is that minority or marginalized persons must declare the authority to speak their truth, to speak their piece, also spelled P-E-A-C-E, not only P-I-E-C-E, to declare their existence and their ideas as powerfully as they can. If I think about, for instance, African American or the Jamaican context that Tricia has mentioned in terms of Rastafarianism, what's powerful about those histories, and this is true for many marginalized and racialized groups all over the world, especially in minority situations, is that it's through the music, it's through the song that the first pulses of resistance are voiced. So I think of the spirituals. And their spiritual commentary on oppression. I think of blues as a statement of the subjection experience socioeconomically, politically. I think of reggae. I think of Marley. I think of the beautiful religion of Rastafarianism calling for oneness and calling for the equality of I and I. And that music coupled with words, even rap. And I know that some people are upset about some of the content of rap at different times, and they should be and they can be. But at the same time, that's true. It is also the voice of persons who have been subjected and silenced and are speaking, attempting to speak what they see as their reality. And if I may add to this answer by reading very briefly this poem, To Tangiers, I will. So here it is, Tangiers, which is actually in the voice of a slave or sailor. Bird song brightens dawn. Extravagant stutters spiral from the minaret. Thanks to strikes and strokes of wind, the sea throws up jumpy sculptures, undulant, turbulent humps, then dump down suddenly, then upburst, lumpy again. It is how Europe convulses, dissolves into Africa. See, our lungs mar grammar. The sea is assaulting and somersaulting syntax. Black gums and ivory teeth are hashing up, cannibalizing every white skin tongue. What to do? Steep deep into wine, avid, curving through our throats, to our guts, while His Majesty's warships tackle the crack where horizon hatches see. No matter how professional we slavers are, we grope through water as if it were glinting darkness. When we tell our history, it is a sun British sunk down in mud. History explodes all our maps. We enter a purse of shadows.
Beautiful, George. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
I'm so struck by the range of voices we've almost inhabited through all of your poems today, from sort of someone maybe just hovering above Sandra Scheuer's life and death to, again, there in the mind of a slaver, I believe is the word you used, to a house that is being demolished, presumably by the IDF, to, I'm just genuinely I'm struck by the shift of perspective and the different ways that we've been asked to look at this devastation of war.
can I just say one more thing in the answer to that question about minority writers? And it was there partly in what I just read, but we need to seize our language for ourselves. You know, according to some, they may say you speak French bad, you speak English poorly, your Spanish is bad grammar, and so on. Well, yes, that's right, because it's ours. We don't have to speak the exact language and vocables and grammar of the ruling class or our former rulers and so on. We have the power as language artists to make our language speak and sing for ourselves, no matter what. And I think that that's one of the most powerful ways for minority persons to speak back, is to take command of your language, no matter how supposedly bad it is. Bad in whose ears? Bad in whose eyes? No. We'll decide for ourselves how we want to speak.
And of course, it was Arundhati Roy who said there's really no such thing as the voiceless. They're only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. I think of that often. Gary, I want to turn the last word to you here before we truly run out of time. If there's any thoughts on any of these recent questions or something else you'd like to say before we wrap up.
No, I'm like you. I'm full of all these voices that have been reverberating from George and myself, and from the questions and your comments. It's been really great having you as the hostess, and having Tricia to help us as well. And you and David and Tricia and the others should be the next Nobel laureates for the Peace Prize.
Well, thank you so much with that to both of you. Someone in the audience wrote, "This is the very Zoom event I needed to mitigate the gut feeling of today's atrocious warmongering." And I think both of you approached the topic absolutely head on, unflinchingly, but in a way that is such a bomb to what we've all been doom scrolling through if you've been on the internet all day like me all day. So thank you so much, both of you, for your generosity in sharing your poetry, but also your personal stories and your commentary in such a heartful and heartfelt way. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience who held the space with us. I did periodically sort of look through the audience as though it was an auditorium, looking around at faces, and just to see everyone so engaged is not a strong enough word, but just so transfixed by the poetry was really special to see. We will send out a recording of this event to everyone who registered. Feel free to share that link with others as well. We'll also share the links once again to purchase those two collections that I shared links to, but also to the others that poems were shared from today. I see people are asking about the poetry that wasn't in those collections. So we have a very avid and attentive audience who wants to do their research and homework. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, we of course feel that we need to use all the ways available to us to resist war, to abolish war. And we will, of course, share many other ways in the coming days that take different approaches. How do we take action? How do we take direct action? How do we stand up to our governments about these drumbeats of war? And so I look forward to seeing you all again. So again, thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Rachel, David, Tricia, everybody, and peace. Peace. Yes. Amen.
Thank you. Have a good evening. This was wonderful.
Good night.
Night.